They stood at the altar, holding hands, promising forever in front of God, but somewhere between, "I do," and "I tried," they forgot what love truly meant. It began like every beautiful love story does. Two hearts, full of hope, standing before God, believing their love was different. They looked into each other's eyes and saw forever, not knowing that forever is not found in feelings, but in commitment. At the beginning, everything felt easy. The late-night talks, the laughter, the way they held hands like nothing in the world could pull them apart. They called it love. And maybe it was, but it was the kind of love that hadn't been tested yet. Because real love, the kind God designed, is not just about how you feel when everything is perfect. It's about how you stay when everything begins to fall apart. Days passed, and slowly, something changed. They stopped praying together. Not intentionally, just gradually. One night mist turned into a habit. And without realizing it, they began to fight battles without inviting God into them. And when God is not at the center, even the strongest love begins to feel weak. Then came the misunderstandings. Small things turned into big arguments. Words spoken in anger started to leave scars. Instead of choosing patience, they chose pride. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry," they waited to be right. Ego quietly took the place of humility. They both wanted love, but neither wanted to surrender. And that's where most Christian marriages begin to break, not because love is gone, but because love is no longer practiced the way God intended. They expected perfection from each other, forgetting that they themselves were imperfect. They wanted to be understood, but stopped trying to understand. Forgiveness became harder. Silence became louder. Distance grew, not in miles, but in hearts. And one day, they sat in the same room, feeling like strangers. Not because they didn't love each other anymore, but because they forgot that love is not just something you feel, it's something you choose every single day. Christian marriages don't fail because God's design is broken. They fail when people stop following that design. Because marriage was never meant to be just a connection between two people. It was meant to be a covenant with God at the center. A place where love is patient, even when it hurts. Where forgiveness is given, even when it's undeserved. Where two imperfect people keep choosing each other, again and again, not because it's easy, but because it's sacred. And maybe, just maybe, if they had remembered that love is not about winning arguments, but protecting the bond. If they had chosen prayer over pride. If they had held on to God tighter than their ego. Their story wouldn't have ended in silence. It would have continued, as the kind of love story that doesn't just start in front of God, but survives because of Him. In the beginning, their love felt like a beautiful miracle. Every glance carried meaning, every message brought excitement, and every moment together felt like a glimpse of heaven. They believed this intensity, this emotional connection, was enough to carry them through a lifetime. It felt so right, so natural, so effortless, that they never stopped to ask what it was truly built on. They mistook emotional chemistry for spiritual foundation. They prayed individually, but rarely together. They spoke about dreams, plans, and feelings, but not enough about God's purpose for their union. Their relationship was filled with affection, but it lacked alignment with faith. And without realizing it, they began building something eternal on something temporary, feelings that could change with time. Feelings are powerful, but they are not stable. There were days when love felt strong, when everything seemed perfect and unbreakable. But there were also days when emotions shifted, when stress, misunderstandings, and life's pressures made that same love feel distant and fragile. And in those moments, they didn't have a deeper foundation to hold them together. Because faith is what anchors love when feelings fade. They never truly learned how to bring God into their relationship as a daily presence. Not just in celebrations, not just in public prayers, but in the quiet, difficult moments where love is tested. They didn't seek guidance through faith when conflicts arose, nor did they rely on spiritual strength to overcome emotional weakness. Instead, they depended on how they felt in the moment. When they felt loved, they gave love. When they felt hurt, they withdrew. When they felt misunderstood, they became distant. And slowly, their relationship became controlled by emotions rather than grounded in faith. Love, without faith, becomes conditional. It begins to rely on moods, circumstances, and expectations. It starts strong, burns bright, but struggles to endure when the initial excitement fades. Because what they had was real, but it wasn't rooted deeply enough to survive storms. They never realized that true Christian love is not just about feeling close to each other. It's about staying connected through God, even when they feel far apart. And that's where the cracks quietly began to form. At the start, their connection felt almost sacred. They believed God had brought them together, that their love had a divine purpose. In the early days, they spoke about faith, shared a few prayers, and felt spiritually aligned. But as time moved forward, life became busy, emotions became complicated, and those small spiritual habits slowly began to disappear. Not all at once, but little by little. One missed prayer together didn't seem like a big deal. Then another. And then it became something they only did occasionally, and eventually, not at all. They still believed in God, but they stopped inviting Him into their relationship daily. Their bond, once lightly rooted in faith, began to drift toward routine and emotion. At the same time, something else started increasing. Arguments. At first, they were small disagreements, differences in opinions, misunderstandings, moments of stress. But without prayer to soften their hearts, those small conflicts began to grow. Words became sharper, reactions became quicker, and instead of seeking peace together, they tried to prove their point. They spent more time defending themselves than understanding each other. Prayer has a quiet power. It humbles the heart, slows down anger, and reminds two people that they are not enemies but partners. But without it, pride begins to rise. Without it, emotions take control. Without it, love starts to feel like a competition instead of a connection. And that's exactly what happened. When they argued, they didn't pause to pray. When they felt hurt, they didn't seek God's guidance. When tension filled the room, they chose silence or harsh words instead of spiritual grounding. They were trying to fix a spiritual bond with emotional reactions. The more they argued, the more distance grew between them. Not just emotionally, but spiritually. Because when two people stop praying together, they slowly stop aligning with each other's hearts. They begin to see each other as the problem, instead of facing the problem together. Prayer could have been their bridge. A moment to step back, to breathe, to remember that love is not about winning. A chance to soften their voices, to replace anger with understanding, to invite peace where tension lived. But instead, arguments became more frequent than prayers. And when a relationship speaks more in anger than in faith, it slowly forgets the language of love. In the beginning, they were gentle with each other. Love made them patient, understanding, and willing to overlook small flaws. They listened more, spoke kindly, and carried a quiet humility that allowed their relationship to feel safe. Back then, being right was never more important than being together. But over time, something subtle began to change. What once felt like softness slowly turned into resistance. The willingness to understand each other was replaced with the need to be understood first. Conversations were no longer about connection, they became silent battles of who was right and who was wrong. Ego entered quietly, but it didn't stay small. It showed up in the way they responded during disagreements. Instead of listening with an open heart, they listened to defend themselves. Every word became a chance to prove a point. Every mistake became something to highlight rather than forgive. Saying, "I'm sorry," started to feel like losing. Admitting fault felt heavy, almost impossible. Even when they knew they were wrong, something inside held them back. Pride whispered that apologizing would make them weak, that standing firm, even in error, was a form of strength. But real strength was slowly fading. Because humility is what keeps love alive. It allows two people to lower their defenses, to admit imperfections, and to choose peace over pride. Without humility, love becomes rigid. It stops flowing and starts resisting. They both wanted to be valued, but neither wanted to bend. Small issues that once would have been resolved with a simple apology now stretched into long silences. Misunderstandings grew deeper because neither was willing to take the first step toward healing. They waited for the other to change, to admit, to surrender. And in that waiting, distance grew. Ego doesn't just create conflict, it sustains it. It turns moments into memories that hurt, and words into wounds that last longer than they should. It builds invisible walls between two hearts that once felt so close. And the more those walls grow, the harder it becomes to reach each other. They forgot that love is not about standing tall against each other. It's about kneeling together in humility. And slowly, without even realizing it, their relationship stopped being a place of comfort, and started becoming a place of quiet competition. In the beginning, their love felt flawless. Every moment seemed touched by grace, every word carried kindness, and every action felt intentional. They saw each other through the lens of admiration, where even imperfections looked beautiful. It felt like they had found someone who completed them, someone who would never hurt them. But slowly, reality began to reveal itself. They were not perfect. They were human. Mistakes started to appear, small at first. A forgotten promise, a careless word, a moment of insensitivity. These were not acts of betrayal, but they still carried weight. And instead of meeting those moments with grace, something else began to take root. Expectation. They began to expect each other to always say the right thing, to always understand without explanation, to always act with care. And when those expectations weren't met, disappointment replaced patience. They forgot that love is not about finding a perfect person. It's about embracing an imperfect one with a forgiving heart. Forgiveness, at one time, felt natural. In the early days, they would let things go easily, choosing peace over tension. But as time passed, forgiveness became slower, heavier, almost reluctant. They started keeping quiet records of each other's mistakes, remembering what should have been released. Every unresolved hurt became a silent burden. Instead of healing, wounds were stored. Instead of being discussed with love, they were revisited during arguments. Words like, "you always," and "you never," began to replace understanding. And with every repeated mistake, their patience grew thinner. They wanted change, but without offering grace. Forgiveness requires humility, the ability to let go even when it hurts, to choose love over the need to be right. But they began to see forgiveness as something the other person had to earn, rather than something they could freely give. And that's where the distance deepened. Because without forgiveness, love becomes fragile. Every mistake feels heavier, every argument feels longer, and every silence feels colder. The relationship begins to carry the weight of the past instead of the hope of the present. They both long to be understood, to be accepted despite their flaws. But neither fully offered that same acceptance in return. And in that space where grace should have lived, resentment slowly began to grow. In the beginning, their relationship felt like a deep and beautiful connection. It was built on attraction, understanding, shared moments, and the joy of being together. They laughed, they dreamed, they imagined a future that felt certain. To them, marriage was the next natural step, an extension of what they already felt. And so, they stood before God and made promises. Promises that sounded strong, sacred, and unbreakable. Words like, forever, always, and, no matter what, flowed easily in that moment. Surrounded by love and celebration, it felt like nothing could ever shake what they had. But deep within, they didn't fully understand what those promises truly meant. Because they saw marriage as a connection, not as a covenant. A connection is based on feelings. It thrives when emotions are high and everything feels right. It grows when there is happiness, affection, and mutual understanding. But it can weaken when those emotions fade, when life becomes difficult, and when challenges begin to test the bond. A covenant is different. It is not based on changing emotions, but on an unchanging commitment. It is a promise made not only to each other, but to God. A covenant doesn't depend on how you feel in the moment, it calls you to remain, to endure, to stay faithful even when love feels hard. And that's what they slowly forgot. When problems came, they approached them as individuals trying to protect their own feelings, instead of as partners bound by a sacred promise. When things became difficult, they questioned the relationship instead of strengthening their commitment. They began to think in terms of, what I'm getting, rather than, what I vowed to give. The mindset shifted quietly. Instead of seeing marriage as something to honor, they started treating it like something to evaluate. When happiness decreased, they felt like something was wrong. When challenges increased, they felt like something was missing. They forgot that struggle is not a sign of failure, but often a test of commitment. Because a covenant is not sustained by convenience. It is sustained by choice. The choice to stay when it's uncomfortable. The choice to love when it's difficult. The choice to honor the promise, even when emotions are uncertain. They were still connected, but no longer anchored. And without that understanding of covenant, their relationship began to feel temporary, fragile, and dependent on circumstances rather than grounded in something eternal.